March 6, 1945, the second day of the 3rd Armored Division's battle for Cologne started from the railroad underpass at the West Railroad Station on Benlorstrasse. Machine guns set up on rubble piles protected the column along the track area to the north.
The black and white newsreels of World War II marked the beginning of a new era in documenting warfare. For the first time, motion picture photography was used extensively as a tool to capture the reality of war. The local movie theaters actually became the battlefields, and the Americans at home could stay informed about their loved ones through this magic celluloid window. What the audience at home never saw were the brave men behind the cameras. These brave combat photographers and soldiers were constantly at risk because their job required them to be in the middle of the combat they were photographing. They were frontline soldiers, and often they were required to put down their cameras and pick up a gun to join in the battle. Of the original 65 American motion picture cinematographers who photographed the war for the First Army in Europe, less than 30 survived the war. Of those 30, only a handful are alive today to tell the story about these brave soldiers who witnessed the scenes of war through the lens of a camera. Jim Bates was a 26-year-old cinematographer and director working for the Alexander Film Company in Colorado Springs when he joined the Army. His experiences at the Alexander Film Company prepared him for his duties as a cameraman, but nothing could prepare him for his horrific combat experiences as a soldier during World War II. From the beginning of the European invasion at Normandy until the fall of Berlin, Sergeant Technician Jim Bates was both a photographer and a soldier in many of the major battles in Northern Europe. In this video portrait, Ree Mobley, the head of the local history department at the Pikes Peak Library District, takes us back in time through the memories, photographs, and motion picture film of Jim Bates, a video portrait of a combat photographer. If you were to meet Jim Bates in the streets of Colorado Springs, you would never guess this soft-spoken 76-year-old man met and photographed most of the major leaders of World War II. But once you learn more about Jim's life in Colorado Springs, you can see why this special person was the right individual chosen to march across Europe as a combat photographer. A physically active man all his life, Jim still climbs Pikes Peak every year with the Ataman Club on New Year's Eve. The oldest member of the group, and also their official photographer, Jim has made this dangerous winter climb almost 40 times. Ed Kirchis is a good friend of Jim Bates, and also the 3rd oldest member of the Ataman Club, a World War II veteran in the 10th Mountain Division. Ed and Jim's combat experiences are a common bond.
Jim is really a tough specimen to watch on the climb. I can remember years ago, we thought it was great that we had a member who was 70 years of age that made the climb, and here he's 76. And I don't think it'll stop yet.
Jim Bates was born in Boulder, Colorado on May 14, 1916. His father was an aeronautical engineer, and he moved his family to southern Colorado when Jim was around 8 years old. Jim always loved the outdoors, and from a very early age enjoyed the camping and hiking opportunities Colorado Springs provided. The Alexander Film Company was a major employer in Colorado Springs from the 1920s until the 1960s. Before the age of television, Alexander Film was the largest commercial advertising production house for movie theaters in the United States. Jim Bates started his motion picture career with Alexander Film while he was still a student at Colorado Springs High School. It was his 7 years of experience at Alexander Film which made him a prime candidate for being a combat photographer. Although Jim's life is much more than his wartime experiences, the focus of this documentary is on his 3 years in the Army, and more specifically on the 1 year he spent photographing combat in Europe. It was a remarkable year that forever remains an important part of his life. Jim's first experience photographing world leaders began while he was still in the United States, and he had the opportunity to photograph President Franklin Roosevelt. It was a humorous and memorable experience for both men.
There were at Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, there was an inspection of the infantry division just before they left, and President Roosevelt was there to inspect the division. And I was down in the corner out of his way in this little gazebo making pictures of him, and when he made that salute to the flag, I made a picture of him. Of course, in the gazebo it had to be flash bulbs, and the flash bulb went off in his face and exploded. Oh. Well, his men had me crammed down in the corner so tight that I couldn't even move. And he said, "Let him alone, let him alone. I know what's wrong." He says, "Those damn flash bulbs he has to use." He says, "I'll give you what you want." He says, "Now let's get set, let's start over again." So I said, "Well, would you give me that nice little salute that you gave before when the flag was?" "Sure." And another one blew up in his face. Wasn't the Wabash were there. There were GI Wabash globes. They were frightening things.
Jim Bates was transferred to England and was attached to General Eisenhower's newsreel team. Jim had a few months to train for the invasion, and during his time in England, he met his future bride, Monica Catherine Howard. Jim trained as a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne after General Gavin asked him if he would like to volunteer as a photographer for the invasion.
And pretty soon General Gavin came over and asked me, he said, "Would you boys like to make the big drop with us?" And I said, "Sir, I don't know what you're talking about, big drop." I was playing it cool, of course. And he said, "Well, the invasion jump." And I said, "But when do we don't know anything about parachuting." And he said, "Well, we'll take care of that, don't worry." I said, "When do we start?" And he says, "Right now."
In England, General Dwight D. Eisenhower and his deputy commanders chart the liberation of a lost continent, plan when and where the mighty armies of the United Nations will strike. Today, northern France is that battleground.
At 150 pounds, Jim's weapons and camera equipment weighed as much as he did, and the weight of his equipment almost killed him during the invasion jump.
I was in the second plane of the invasion, actually. That's where General Gavin said I would be. Being the second man over, I looked down as I jumped, and I was right over the river, the canal, and went down into the canal, and it was over my head, and when I looked up, the air bell in the top of my helmet went glug, and I thought, oh, if I only had that much air in my lungs. Well, I was about to give it up, but fortunately, I realized I should try and slip to the rear at the time I jumped, because I could look down and see nothing but that canal, being probably 400 feet off the ground. So I was hanging onto my risers, and as I kept playing my chute, not realizing it under the water, I was frantically tugging on my risers. Why, a breeze come along and pulled me over to the opposite bank, to the bank that I didn't want to be on.
Jim was lucky to be alive, but his camera equipment was filled with water and useless after landing in the canal. Without his photography equipment, Jim focused on being a soldier for the first few days of the invasion.
In this early morning dawn, I was laying there and looking up at the sky, and this pink sky and the sunrise coming up, and I thought, my God, I've gone through all this training, and they sent me out to fight the war all by myself. That's how lonely you feel. And all at once, this voice rang out, "Now!" And I looked up, and I was looking right down the machine gun of a command car. And I don't know why he never pulled the trigger to this day, But I had my Gammon grenade ready, and I screamed down because of the concussion from those, just unmerciful. And all I did was scream down. I threw that at that command car, and it just riddled it. Everything just flew apart. They took that first group. But when they got through with them, there just wasn't anyone left. But evidently, what it was it was an officer trying to get to St. Lo to headquarters to figure out what had happened, to report the fact that there was an invasion, but he never made it that far. No one in that column did.
So these were the first Germans that...
So there was a leg came down close to me. It had been blown up, and it was like a frog leg. It was moving, and I jumped on it, and I said, "Lay still, darn you." And I don't know why I ever did that. It was nothing. It was just something that you'd never think that you would ever do. But it just did something that, it just fired something inside of me.
Getting used to death is something all soldiers must face when they first experience combat. Even a compassionate person like Jim Bates found a way to insulate his feelings, and also found time to help a fellow soldier deal with the horror.
On D-Day morning, when this piece of a leg came down right beside me, it just blew things to pieces right there. This fellow back of me, when I jumped on this leg and told it to lay still, this fellow right back of me said, "You know, that was the best thing you could have done, because I cried for 3 days when I shot my first German." Everybody, to start with, has this feeling of humanity. But then after a while, it begins to be a kind of a machine, and you begin to feel like a machine. And you do what you have to do, and you get a shell around yourself. When you're seeing all these things, you don't really let it bother you. On D-Day morning, no, it was D+3 about, I came across this medic that had seen so much just absolutely unbelievable situations with his buddies and the troopers, of being torn, bodies maimed, legs off, whatnot. And he just says, "I can't take it anymore." And when I came across him down near the river, he had taken morphine to the point to where he was completely out of it. And he says, "I can't take it anymore, I can't take it anymore," and he was going to run in and drown himself. And I said, "Nuh-uh, just sit down, and I'll stay with you for a while. We'll wait till it wears off." And after it wore off, then he felt better, and he says, "Okay, I think, thank you." He said, thank you. He said, "Oh." But that was, I guess, I instilled, the trooper blood instilled in me just enough to know that's what you have to do to keep yourself and your buddies going.
The city of Cherbourg was the headquarters for the German U-boats that harassed Allied shipping in the Atlantic. Taking Cherbourg was an important victory for the Allies. Jim captured this enemy film, which shows combat footage shot by Jim's German counterpart during the time the Nazis ruled the Atlantic. In addition to the film, Jim and his crew found another surprise in a German bunker.
My assistant and I was photographing the driver, and it was just a combination of myself, and my driver was photographing the bunkers. And I was all set up on a tripod and going to make a pan shot, and this white flag came out, and I belched out at him, "Was willst du haben?" And he wanted to surrender. I asked him what he wanted, and first the white flag came out, and then just the head of this bunker. And I said, "Okay, surrender and put all your weapons over here." And there was hundreds of them that came out of that bunker. They had every kind of weapon that you could possibly imagine. They all piled them up. It was a tremendous pile of weapons when they got through. They wanted to know where they could surrender, and there wasn't anyone there except me, and I was one of the very first to get down to that area. So I said, "Well, just follow the road out. Go to the main road and go out, and you'll run into somebody to surrender."
The duties of a combat photographer requires them to always be in combat in order to do their job. This hazardous occupation required Jim to photograph whatever division was at the front.
So were you with General Bradley? Or
General Bradley was yes, he was head of First Army. And I was always out on the front lines photographing most everything that come along, and I never did get back there too much. It was one of those things that we left that to the commercial people as much as possible. But anyhow, like we always said at that time, divisions come and division goes, but what's left of the 165, we go on forever. And we did. It just seemed like that no matter what division would go or come, why we would always wind up having to be going from one division to another, and as long as we could stand it. See, I had an Eisenhower pass that stated that no commanding officer, no one will tell me what I can or cannot photograph. That it will be that the auditing or the censoring will be done at Army Pictorial Service headquarters, and anything that will be anything that's photographed that has to be divisioned or have to be put off in one segment or another will be done there. And that's where that came from. They always sent us back reports as to what we were doing, as well as our Sinex strips, as to how our coverage looked and how it was received and what happened.
In wartime, there are atrocities committed by both sides. It is difficult to maintain the moral standards learned in civilian life when revenge and reprisal are part of the natural law of warfare. It was Jim's misfortune to witness in film one of the atrocities of the war.
It was with the 82nd Airborne, and that was D+12 maybe. We moved into a meadow, and there was unthinking, a young trooper dug a foxhole right out in the middle of the pasture instead of on the edge of the perimeter in the hedgerow area. And there was a bluff right beyond us, and the Germans were on that bluff, and they machine gunned him. And the medics went out and carried a white flag, and they machine gunned him. And another medics went out, and they machine gunned him. That made the troopers mad, and they encircled that whole group that was up on the bluffs and brought them down. And they were all Panzer Division. They were the elite troops. Didn't care what they did. They brought them all down, and they said, "That you shot a soldier, okay. You shot a medics with a white flag, no good. You shot another medics with a white flag, that's worse." And they took him down the road, and they said, "Jim, come on, we're going to turn him in." And they were talking to me. "Bring your camera and come on." And they got down next to well, it was a trucking outfit that the Germans had abandoned, and there was trucks and all kinds of equipment in there that was alongside the road. And this little guy screamed, "Jim, get your damn pictures." And immediately he turned this machine gun, Tommy gun, on these prisoners. I know it was not right to do, but you don't think about what you're doing. I didn't know what he was going to do, and I stopped as soon as I could, but there was a matter of 3 seconds that the whole thing had happened. That night I was afraid. It scared me to death to think that if somebody came in and captured me and they got that film, what they would do to me and to everyone else, what psychologically it would do. I couldn't take the film out because what I got before and after that shot was so valuable that I didn't want to lose it. I got a written statement on my critique sheet that I got back from London. You will not show prisoners being shot. And I wrote back on the back of that same form, I sent it back. It's too bad that some of you people that sit back there and censor and criticize what we do out in the field cannot realize what pressures that you're under and what you do when you find out that something is happening and you have lost it, may have lost it.
It is only a matter of time before a frontline soldier becomes a casualty. In a bizarre twist of fate, Jim found himself being treated for a wound while he was lying next to an enemy soldier he had just shot.
I went up and rattled a tank. The GIs were all getting on tanks as much as they could to start out with, because the snow, it takes all of your energy going through the snow, and when you fight a battle, you've got to have your strength. So they were, many of them, riding tanks into the conflict area as much as they could. And I rattled this one tank, and I asked him if I could ride on the back, and the lid flew open. He says, "Can you fire a machine gun?" I said I had my basics with 11th Armored Division, and my guys, they picked me up bodily practically and put me in the bow gunner's position. And we were doing very well. We cut along, and I could see up ahead this German with a bazooka, what we called a bazooka. The soldier was working on a bazooka, and I thought, oh boy, if he gets that sucker wound up, we're dead. And so I blasted him with the 50, and I got him right in the arm. And I saw him keel over, but I knew that that's where it was, because his arm just suddenly went that way, and he went down. So we got a little further, and I couldn't see him because the periscope I was looking main ahead, and I could see then that the other tank way up, the first number 1 tank, had passed an area, an open area, and was firing uphill. And about that time I could hear this ka-thunk, and it sounded like somebody, it sounded like some of these 4-wheel boom boxes the kids have got nowadays in their cars. It almost sounded like that boom, that rumbling feeling. And the tank commander says, "Get the hell out of here, they're shooting at us broadside." Well, we got out and looked up the hill, and here's this great big tiger sitting there all dug in, and the barrel pointed right at us. And the driver said, "You know, if we stay here very much longer, he's going to get us with another AP shell or going to machine gun us, and he's waiting for us to run for it so he can machine gun us." So he said, "Let me see if I can get back in." And of course, both lids opened up to the middle. He slithered back into the tank again and started back, and about that time, that second boom came along, and it felt like a train hit me in the back. I was face down in the snow. I thought I didn't know whether I was dead or alive, and I could hear him screaming, "If you're not hit, get up as soon as you can, because that tank, if he gets that tank started again, he's going to run over you." So I looked back to see where the tank was, and I thought my legs were blown off, but they weren't. And I looked back, and my camera was laying directly under the tank treads. Well, that's what made me move, because I had all that nice footage in there I didn't want to take any chances on, regardless of what condition I was in. And I grabbed my camera, and the tank had just gotten started, and I rolled up underneath the tank and let it go over the top of me. And then I thought, now I'm going to be out here all by myself, and they're going to get me again. And by that time, they were evidently trying to load another shell instead of machine gun. So I put my hand up under the tank, and fortunately I remembered most tanks have a tow cable in the front of them. And I put my hand up on the tank, and just as it went up over the top, I hooked over, and there was that cable. So they pulled me back to the rest of them who were back in the timber. Well, by that time, the artillery officer was ordering artillery on the German tank. Well, they annihilated that tank on the hill, of course. That put an end to that. They said, "Well, are you sure you're all right?" And I said, "No, I don't think so." And I put my hand back, and my shirt was filled full of blood in the back, because it had that shrapnel had gone through my coat, all of it. I had punctured my back. And I said, "Gee, I guess it really did get me." And I put my hand up to my face, and there was blood on my face. So they were on the radio, and they said, "You get up here right quick right now with the medic's jeep." He said, "This photographer's been hit, and there's not enough of them left in here to hardly photograph the rest of the war." And he says, "We're loaded." He says, "I don't care if you are loaded. Get up here." And I said, "Well, I'll ride on the hood. I don't care." I said, "I can lay down and at least be a warm place to be for a bit." So when they got up there, here was this fellow that I had shot, this prisoner. And his arm was practically off, and they had bandaged him up and wrapped it around him. And I said, I guess that was reprisal, wasn't it? You got me, and I got you, and so you got me. And he said, well, I was trying to surrender. And he said, I was trying to tie a white flag on that bazooka. He said, I'm not a soldier, I was a civilian. And they gave me that, told me how to use it, and that was it. And he said, I guess that's why I'm still alive.
Jim recovered quickly from his shrapnel wounds, even though they couldn't remove all the metal pieces from his back. He was awarded the Purple Heart for his combat injury. Anxious to get back to his duties as a combat photographer, Jim rejoined the 82nd Airborne to photograph the end of the Battle of the Bulge.
So anyhow, then the final closing of the Bulge came along, and the 82nd Airborne was to do this. So I said, I went down and looked at the combat readiness report with a board. We had a big board there, situation board. And Holly said, absolutely not, no way. I said, well, I jumped a doggone rest center to get here. I guess I can jump on another, and if I have to get back to get to the 82nd. So he said, well, but you promised to take care of yourself. And I said, yeah. So he said, okay, I'll take you up there. So he took me up, and of course there was no way, because it was all going to be cross country, and it was the most amazing thing. They started out at 2 o'clock in the morning, and it was like a huge serpent in the moonlight going around these mountains and these hills to get to the area where they knew they were going to have to start pinching them off.
There are moments in a person's life when their training, talent, and heart are tested to the extreme. Jim Bates' finest hour was during the Battle of Cologne. For a veteran combat photographer, it was an opportunity to test all his skills as a soldier and as a photographer. It was his success in Cologne that earned him the Bronze Star.
The German tank is found, and the T-26 hits its marks. The German tank is hit squarely, and as the gunner tries to escape, the second shell cuts off his leg. The driver and assistant clamber to escape as another shell is fired. Burning alive, the gunner lies over the edge of his coffin on wheels while his companions run for cover. And the concussion from the 90mm gun is so great, camera steadiness is impossible.
Cologne was the next, I imagine, the greatest part of my life. And still, of course, going across the valley, the whole bit was just one great long push and shove and push and shove. And when the Germans did give, why it was almost a job of catching up with them sometime. But when we got to Cologne, it was again another problem. The Germans had their back against the river, but around the Rhine River. And it was a long, long battle of street fighting. Constantly, they had plugged the underpasses over with Windlorstrassen, at Windlorstrassen with old streetcars, and it was a completely different type of fighting now than it was in the woods and in the timber and out on the plains. Now it was a house-to-house thing. The tanks had to drive cover for the men. The men would sometimes have to go out and lead the tank through. By this time, we had a new T-26, and the T-26 had a 90mm with a cuts compensator on the front of it. It was an amazing piece of machinery. It was heavily armored. It was just, it was a far cry. The Germans that saw it really never lived to bring back the story, because that was it. They never lived long enough to take the story back as to what this tank was about. It was just so far ahead of the old Shermans that it was unbelievable. So the fellow, the commander of the T-26 says, Jimmy said, let's go down and see what we can see on that tank. And he says, I don't know what we're going to run into. We may never get back. But he said, let's see what we can do. So I said, okay. He said, if we can get there, it'll be a good place for pictures. I know. I said, well, I know. That's great. Let's do it. So we got back and went on the mezzanine of a building, and we could look right down, and there was the German tank right like a block away from us. And he said, "Now, I tell you what," he said, "you get all ready for him." And he said, when you hear me coming up underneath you, you'll know where I am, that I am there, and when I stop, I'm ready to fire. So the tank commander of the tank knew very well, of course, of the T-47 left and went back up to his tank, and I sat there, and it seemed like it took forever and a day for them to get started, but of course they had to get all of the mathematics and everything set just exactly right, so they knew exactly what they were going to do in the very second that they stopped that tank. So I thought, well, I was just a little bit impatient, and I got out, and I think the German tank, the Tiger tank, saw me, because he started to turn his turret around, and about that time I heard the tank coming up, our T-26 coming up. And the very second that he stopped, I was shooting by that time. And in the film you can see the armor-piercing shell going through the bottom of the picture on the still shots. The first shot went in and cut the legs off of the tank commander in the Tiger. The second shot, and immediately the driver and the bow gunner, the trap doors flew open, and they climbed out, but a second shot had gotten, the shrapnel had gotten them too. One fellow fell over a bicycle that was laying there on the ground, the remains of an old bicycle, and he died right there. But the driver got around to the back side of a building, and he died there. The gunner, the tank commander that had his legs cut off, of course, just laid on top of his tank and burned up right in front of the camera there. It was just unbelievable. That thing was burning even the next morning. After it was all over, there was still smoke coming out of it because it had so much ammunition and whatnot in it. It was just everything that could happen to me, photographically speaking, did happen that day. There was everything from street fighting to house-to-house fighting, everything that could happen, and consequently, it really was the crux of me getting a Bronze Star. That whole period of time that I worked with the 3rd Armored Division, they were so grateful for all of the coverage that I had given them. I hate to see the 3rd Armored Division going into fading away to nothing now, because that's one of the divisions out of Germany that's being vanished right now, and they did such a beautiful job. General Rose was the head of the 3rd Armored Division, and the General Rose Hospital in Denver, the Veterans Hospital, is named after him.
A very tired and silent crew it was that dealt the death blow to the German tank, to help prove to a nation crazed with power that its men and cities could be dealt with in the same manner as it had previously dealt with Poland and Russia when the war was going its way. The tall spires of the Cologne Cathedral now mark only the grave of a dead and battle-torn city.
The V-2 rocket was an appalling weapon that indiscriminately killed its civilian targets in London. It was a terror weapon whose rocket engine was the first of its kind to be used in war. As horrible as this weapon was, more people were killed making this early missile than the number of people who were killed by it. The German town of Nordhausen is where a concentration camp was built to provide slave labor to manufacture the V-2 rocket. After a year of photographing combat, it was Jim's assignment to photograph the manufacturing plant and the horrors of the concentration camp at Nordhausen. The inhumanity he photographed at Nordhausen had such a profound effect on this veteran combat photographer that he chose not to keep any photographs for his personal collection. The visuals you see from this segment were obtained through the National Archives.
Nordhausen was in the was in the Russian sector, basically. And I was sent up there with a group to photograph Nordhausen, where the V-2 rocket was made. It was like in an area like the Bluffs here, and had two huge tunnels drilled through the thing. It was like a Ford assembly plant. Way back in the back of the room, in the tunnels, they had little offset rooms, offshot rooms, and there was labor prisoners were back there, and they were stripped down to their waist because a lot of them were committing suicide by throwing things in the machines, and like a rag or a towel or anything that they could get their hands on and kill themselves. We worked all morning, and there was a huge pile of nice, soft, woolly stuff there, and I said, oh, that looks like a good place to rest, and reload my camera. No, 999, two of them came over and picked me up and very gently took me off of that because it was fiberglass and it was poisoned. And that was the death job. Anybody that got on that packing, it's fiberglass, never lasted. They stripped them down, I guess, to practically no clothes. And when they packed that glass into the rockets, why then they died of infection from that. It was a terrible sight, the Germans, when they first went in there. The people were, they had an oven in the back. And if anyone was caught trying to escape, they were immediately assassinated and burned. They had a huge pit out in the back, or a big pit, about 6 feet. It had all bones in it. People that were inquiring about their relatives, they'd say, oh, they'd get a letter, the letters from people who were inquiring about their relatives who were taken prisoner, and they'd say, oh, they said they were killed by American bombs and they were burned, but we will send you for, I think it was $50, they'd send them a box with their ashes in it. And it was the job of one of these men that I was with to go scoop up bits of bones out of that pit, and they'd take it up to the front office, and that's what they would send back to the relative and say, as a memento of their person that was supposed to have been lost. When they first started doing this, they could only put one person at a time in the oven. Towards the end, it got so bad that they couldn't put, they could put 3 in the oven at once instead of 1. And then it got so bad that they had no more fuel to burn this in the oven. So then they were digging mass graves and putting them in the mass graves. We uncovered all of that terrible, terrible thing, and I didn't even want pictures of it. I have no pictures of it because I didn't want to keep it. I didn't want any remembrance of it whatsoever.
With the Allied victory in Europe, Jim was grateful to have survived the war. But his work as a photographer was not over.
Then came Berlin. We wasn't sure exactly what was going to happen as far as Berlin was concerned, because we pulled back and let the Russians have the city, at least the majority of it, for a while. That was before the sectors were decided as to where they were going to be. I had 2 jobs to do. I had not only to photograph the conference, but I had to photograph bomb damage in Berlin.
The magnificent Olympic Stadium in Berlin was a symbol of Nazi Germany and Hitler's Third Reich. Not only was it used for the 1936 Olympics, but also for the massive Nazi rallies that Hitler loved to orchestrate. Jim was now shooting in color film, and as part of his job to film bomb damage in Berlin, he spent a day filming what remained of the Olympic Stadium. It was at this great symbol of Nazi Germany that Jim and his friends celebrated in their own way the end of the war and their triumph over the Nazis.
USS Augusta steams into Antwerp, where President Truman is greeted by General Eisenhower. With victory accomplished, the President is on his way to the Big Three meeting at Potsdam with Secretary of State Burns and other aides to work for peace and world prosperity. The Big Three meetings are held in Kaiser Wilhelm's former palace, and President Truman is selected as chairman of the conference. Here, the fate of Germany and the end of Japanese aggression will be settled. Under the flag that flew over the White House when we declared war on the Axis, the President states our aims.
Let's not forget that we are fighting for peace and for the welfare of mankind. We're not fighting for conquest. There's not one piece of territory or one thing of a monetary nature that we want out of this war. We want peace and prosperity for the world as a whole.
The Potsdam Conference determined how Europe was to be divided for many years to come. With the death of Roosevelt, Harry Truman now had to assert himself among other powerful Allied leaders. It was Truman's battles with Stalin that made the Potsdam Conference memorable to Jim.
I learned more respect for Harry Truman there, President Truman, than I can ever tell, because the Russians would scream at him, previous commitments have been made, and he would stand up, and that's where the shoe banging came in, that incident of shoe banging on the tables by the Russians. And he says, I don't care what previous commitments, and they were referring to the Yalta Conference, is what they're referring to. I don't care what previous commitments have been made. You're dealing with me now, so forget it. And he was stern, and he was on an even keel with those people. Stalin just didn't know what to do. He was beside himself to think that this little guy was so little and neat-looking could come up with a fighting rooster sort of a attitude.
The triumph over Germany was one of the greatest moments of Winston Churchill's career. It was Jim's good fortune to photograph Churchill as he toured the remains of the Reichstag, the bombed-out Capitol building of Churchill's greatest adversary. In these still photographs, Jim captured a great man celebrating and reflecting on one of his finest hours.
I was photographing the black market in Berlin one day, and I heard this entourage of vehicles come up behind me. And this voice says, I say there, my boy, what's going on here? I looked around, and there's Churchill sitting in his Jeep with his driver and a whole entourage of people back of him. So I told him that I was photographing the black market. And he, of course, with my uniform, the way it is, I mean, it's got official U.S. Army photographer written all over it, you know, and no question, he knew who I was. And he may have recognized me from up at the Potsdam Conference, but I knew who he was. And so I asked him, I said, would you like to see what's going on without being disturbing what's going on around here? Oh, I'd love it. He gets out of his Jeep, and I put him between myself and my driver, and he stood there and watched all this black market affair going on. They walked around the Reichstag, because this was right on the Reichstag grounds. And they did a walk. He wanted to walk around, and so I got pictures of him on the walk and the tour walking around. And I thanked him very kindly, and he thanked me, and then he left. But he was so cordial. He was the most cordial person. And so he had a cigar in his hand, and I kind of looked at his cigar, and he said, oh, and he put it in his mouth, and so he's got sitting there with this cigar.
It is fitting that Jim's last job was to photograph the recuperating enlisted men of the 2nd Infantry. These brave men, weary from combat, were recuperating at one of Hitler's former retreats called Overhaus, located in the beautiful ancient city of Passau.
Passau was an old ancient city founded by the Romans. It's a crossroads between 3 rivers, the Danube, the Ill, and the Inn River. And there's no question about when they get there, because when they merge, because for quite a ways down the Danube you could see this bright blue, this gray blue, and a gray color, and they all eventually merge. It was a beautiful old city, and to photograph, it was just beside itself. But Oberhaus was used by Hitler and was actually built by the Romans in the old days, and they had towers on the Danube River at that time, even now, that were there when the Romans used it to collect salt tax from the salt boats that went up and down the Danube River. But The Opera House was a kind of a sanitarium or a rest center for the men of the 2nd Armored Division. Among the many things, and there was no officers allowed on that at all, no commissioned officers. There wasn't an officer ever to be seen there. They had women that knew the kitchens. They are the ones that managed the place, that took care of the housekeeping and everything. These fellows were amazing persons, the men that were there, because they were coming up with battle fatigue of all different types that you can possibly imagine. They'd wake up screaming in the middle of the night. And in a monstrous big place like that, it was amazing to know that the voices would carry so far. What we were sent down there to do was to photograph this boat trip that went down the Danube River with the second men on it. It was with rehabilitating them. It was the most beautiful trip that you could ever imagine to be on. It was a huge boat that looked like one of the old side-wheelers on the Mississippi River. It was that type of a boat almost. And they had got together a choir. The officer that was head of the Episcopal Cathedral Choir in St. Louis, Missouri, got together a group of men that could sing. And they made a most a cappella choir, most beautiful voices you would ever want to hear. Men who had been fighting in a battle for a whole year had come up with this capability of going back to what they do so well. This choir would sing on the boat on the way down, and they would sing, they'd go down into Austria as well, of course, because Passau was on a border town, and they'd go into Austria and sing these songs, these songs that the Austrians knew, and they would come out and sing with them as they went down the river.
Photographing these beautiful color images in Passau allowed Jim to recuperate from his own combat fatigue and begin his rehabilitation process to help him forget the year of horror he had witnessed. If you look closely, you can actually see his mental and physical rebirth through these magnificent images. With Jim's photographic skills, and with the contacts he made during the war, he had a chance to go to Hollywood and become a feature film cinematographer. Because of his war experiences and his appreciation of the quality of life in Colorado, Jim's decision to stay in Colorado was an easy one.
Well, you saw some of the best and some of the worst of human nature. How did that change? And you learned a lot about yourself that you would have probably learned in no other way. How did that change what you expected of life and what you expected of people after that?
Well, as I said, I was working with Hollywood people. A lot of the people that worked. One fellow was working in the processing lab at Disney Studios. One was working at MGM. One worked at Columbia. There was a number of different places, and Rube Weiner used to say, "Jim," he said, "I got it all set up for you." He said, "Your brother lives in California," and this was just before we left Germany, and my brother and I was there. He said, "Your brother lives in California." He says, "Go on out in California, and I'll get it all set up. So all you have to do is just walk in the studio." He said, "I've been telling them about you ever since you and I know one another anyhow." I thanked him, and I said, "Okay." So my brother was mustered out in Denver, and because I was here, and then we both drove to Hollywood because he lived just south of Hollywood. And the fellows there said, in the lab, and the cameraman and all of them worked there. Oh, yeah, they all said, "Well, I'd give my bottom dollar to live in Colorado." "You live in Colorado? Oh, that's God's country, the most wonderful place in the world." And the more they said these things, the more I got to thinking. And so then I saw that the head cameraman at Columbia had me for dinner at his home. The phone rang in the middle of the dinner, and he jumped and run to the phone. He said, "Oh, I'll come out right now. If you need me, I'll come out right now." And he was just on pins and needles. And I thought, my goodness sakes, am I trading what I like to do in Colorado for something like this? And I said, and I thanked them very kindly for their tour and everything. And of course, Rube was a long way from coming home yet. And I said, and I thought in my mind, you know, that's a lesson I guess I've learned the hard way. Do what you like to do, but never do what you don't like to do, because you'll never live through it.
Jim spent a total of 29 years at Alexander Film, interrupted only by the 3 remarkable years he spent in the Army. Coming home was an emotional time for Jim, and his former employer had not forgotten him.
D.M. Alexander was building a new building at the Alexander Film Company, where I had worked by that time for 10 years. And I walked up back of him and I said, "Hi, D," and he never even turned around for a minute. He said, "Jim, where in the heck have you been? We're waiting for you. How soon can you come back to work?" And then he turned around and gave me a big old hug.
Persuading his wartime girlfriend to leave England, Jim married Monica Catherine Howard, and they raised a family in Colorado Springs. Jim and Monica had 3 sons, Bernard, Gordon, and Philip, and the family lived a quiet life in a home that Jim had built himself. Unfortunately, Jim's life back in the United States has not been without tragedy. His youngest son, Philip, died of a brain tumor in 1968. After leaving Alexander Film in 1964, Jim went on to work at the National Office of the International Typographical Union and created and managed their audiovisual department. Jim retired from the ITU in 1985, and he still is actively producing audiovisual programs through his own private production company. Jim has lived a remarkable life, but only recently has he taken the time to evaluate his wartime experiences.
That was a thing that we accepted. We did our job. We got back and we forgot about it. As a matter of fact, it hasn't been until the last few years, until this 50th anniversary, that I've begun to dig deeper on many of the things that I had done during the war that I had to refresh my memory on, because 50 years is a long time. Of course, if you live something once, you'll never forget it. That's the thing. If you really live an experience like that, there's no way that you can ever forget what it's all about.